All right, today's talk's title is actually Large Language Models for the Modern Social Scientist, because this is particularly with a focus for social scientists and tasks that we might have or problems that we might want to counter using large language models. So let me just jump right into it. So just to clarify, there's three things that this workshop is not about. So first of all, it's not doing research with large language models. So there's a large literature right now emerging using large language models to perform different tasks. For example, using the OpenAI API to feed it data. There's a lot of research currently going on, for example, in the mathematical sciences. None of that will be covered in this workshop. This is purely for practical applications in your everyday work. I'm also not going to talk about doing research on large language models. Similar motivation, I purely treat them here as tools. And then I'm also not going to give you an in-depth explanation about large language models because that's a quite difficult and complex area. So what is this workshop about? First of all, I just want to give you a very brief overview of what these models do under the hood, because then I think you understand some of the problems also better that arise. Which type of models are available, because there's a lot of different models that you can choose from. I'm going to showcase a few of them. And then a handful of examples of how they are useful or how I have found them useful, and many other people I've talked to who use them on a daily basis have found them useful. Okay, so what is a large language model? Fundamentally, it's this, a so-called neural network. So what do we have here? We have input layers, which means we have one layer that takes some kind of input. Then that input is routed through different hidden layers. Those nodes in the hidden layers are activated, and at some point they generate an output layer, which is, for example, classification or some sort of outcome based on that. So one of the classic examples for this is, does anyone know what this is?
The numbers for the post office, like that data set.
So this is called OCR, so object recognition. So the post office, for example, has an issue that everybody's handwriting is different, so people write a 6 differently. But we can develop automated systems that detect, that can, for example, recognize numbers. So what this example shows is you have the number 6, and it's been rotated a few times, and the direction has been changed a little bit, different densities of the lines. But basically what this does, or what this example shows, is that you can take an input, you can rasterize it, so let's say 100 by 100 pixels, and then the pixels have different colors. That's your input layer. You throw that into the neural network, and then through a few other tricks, like for example backpropagation, the network can learn what the shape of the 6 is, and then give you an output, and the output in that case is, for example, give you a probability what the most likely number is. In that case, it would be a 6. So that's kind of a very high level introduction into these models. What GPT is a special flavor of a neural network. It is a transformer. And transformers, not like this transformer, also not like this transformer, but more like this transformer. So you have an input, in this case, the French sentence. You throw it into an encoder, it encodes it, does a similar thing as the previous thing that I showed you, then a decoder, and it gives you an output, I am a student. So these models have been incredibly efficient at translating, for example, text. So if you use any type of deep learning, for example, for translation, they work really well. So that's the architecture that ChatGPT is based on. If you want to dive into that stuff, I can highly recommend you watching 3 Blue, 1 Brown's series on neural networks. He also talks about ChatGPT in another series. I think that's a great explanation at a very good or at a level that I think most people, even with no significant quantitative background, can grasp. So basically, what is a transformer? You put some stuff like text or numbers in it, and they generate an output based on that input. So for example, you give it a sentence, and then it does some predictions on what you want from that sentence. There's also a reading list if you want to get more into transformers by Sebastian Raschka, which I can also recommend. I can make these slides available to everyone who wants it, just if they want to have the links and the references, so no need to write that down. But there's still the elephant in the room, which I generated via GPT-4 Omni, so also has text generation capabilities. So a lot of people say ChatGPT is bullshit, that it's just a stochastic parrot, it doesn't really help. And there's still obviously some problems, so I'll just give you a minute to read this tweet. So maybe ChatGPT is a time traveler and already knows that in 2028, Joe Biden and Donald Trump will run again. I don't think so, but yeah, sometimes it outputs gibberish or it comes up with factually incorrect information. But I think the perfect is the enemy of the good, and things are also improving at a rapid pace. So if anyone has, for example, followed the developments from GPT 3.5 to now 4 Omni, it's been incredible. The rate of development is mind-boggling. So for example, now research shows that in conversations, in a 5-minute chat, it's harder and harder to determine whether somebody's human or if they're chatting with a chatbot. So here, for example, GPT 3.5 does perform worse than GPT-4. I think the closer or the more we develop these models, the better or the closer they will come to actually human performance. Also now, so this is research using GPTs. So here, for example, one of my committee members, BK Lee, is part of a paper where they use large language models to improve survey performance. So that's a really cool article I would recommend you to check out. And a friend of mine, Zachary, has built a pipeline to code text examples using the ChatGPT API, and has found that it actually does perform quite similar to human coders, and also can detect cases where it's difficult for human coders to come up with a classification of a text. So lots of interesting stuff happening. I think if you want to learn about the kind of long-term view, what will happen in the future, what might happen in the future, it's a really interesting long-form essay, Situational Awareness, the Decade Ahead, that talks a little bit about what AI progress might mean in the future. So I'd stay tuned and check out what's going to happen in the future. Okay, if you have any questions, you can either come to me after the talk or send me an email, and I'll make the slides available for anyone who's interested. Okay, so that's the short presentation. Now, so one way is not to use GPT is, for example, for images. This is a retracted article that is that nobody knows how they made it past peer review, but they managed to publish this paper with this figure using, I think this was Stable Diffusion or some other program to generate pictures. Yeah, so don't use it like this. However, how we can use GPT effectively, it's a little bit awkward because I can't see the screen on my laptop. So let me just give you a quick introduction to the general interface of GPT. So the first thing that a lot of people tell me when we talk about GPT is, for example, yeah, GPT sucks, it gives me a lot of bad answers. Then usually the question comes up, do you pay for it? And they say no. So they have only access to the free version, which used to be 3.5, which was okay, but really not that great. If you're a serious user, so now I think the default version is GPT-4, which is so much better than 3.5. If you pay $20 per month, you get access to GPT-4 Omni, which has a lot more capabilities, and I would strongly recommend if you use it for anything seriously work-related. So it looks like this. It's kind of a chat box here. Here you can choose the different models. I don't really see a reason why not to default to GPT-4 Omni, which I always do. And so one thing that I think a lot of people are not aware about is you can use baseline GPT. So for example, so you give it a prompt, and then it comes up with some sort of answer, right? So for example, I've used it for dinner planning or just like coming up with ideas. Because I had a few random ingredients, I threw them into ChatGPT and asked it, okay, can you come up with some sort of edible food that I can make out of this random stuff? So I'm sure a lot of you have used it like this. But if you subscribe to GPT, you can also build your own GPT. So you can create a GPT here. So then I'll say, hi, I'll help you build a new GPT. You can say something like, make a creative who helps generate visuals for new products, or make a software engineer who helps format my code. What would you like to make? So let's, for example, build a GPT that puts out R code. So we can write, I work with R. I use a lot of large data sets. Can you help me build a GPT? Okay, so now GPT gives you some of the basics. So role and goal, this GPT will assist with handling large data sets in R, providing code snippets, troubleshooting, and optimizing performance. Constraints, it should avoid making any changes to data without explicit instructions and ensure code is efficient and accurate. Guidelines, offer best practices for data handling in R, suggest packages and provide clear explanations, clarification, personalization. I'll set this up. What name would you like for this GPT? How about data R assistant or R data assistants? So you can configure this in a way that you want it to. For example, if you want a Python assistant, or you could also tell it, for example, I want to primarily work in R, but sometimes if I have to do something in Python, I want you to be able to, for example, output Python code if a problem can, for example, not be solved in R or packages are not available. So it also generates a little logo for you. Would you like to make any changes? No, that's great. So now it asks you, refining the context a bit more. So what should be emphasized or avoided in the assistant's responses? Don't be verbose. Just give me code with comments. So here I instruct GPT, and it's kind of like talking to a human. I want you to not put out a lot of unnecessary words. I want you to go straight to the code, and I want you to comment the code. I want to respond formal. So in the background, it's working. Okay. So now we've built our own personalized assistant. So for example, now if we'd use it, we should get responses using R code. Let's see. I will exit this now. So I've did a few examples, and I'll just quickly go through it. So for this workshop, I downloaded, or I should preface this, GPT also now has advanced data analysis capabilities. So it has a built-in Python environment that can run code. So for example, here I provided with a link to a serials data set with 80 serials, different ratings, and I asked it to download it for me. I want to give me a broad overview. Unfortunately, it failed downloading it, so it wrote the right code, but it didn't work. So I uploaded the CSV, which you can do here. So it automatically reads the file, looks at it, and then gives me an overview of the data set. So it comes up with name, manufacturer, type, and so forth. Now it computes also automatically summary statistics, so you can use those. Makes it a nicer formatted table. And then it starts creating plots. So for example, it's able to create a correlation plot on its own. We can also look at different distribution plots. Or for example, rating my manufacturer. So there's a bunch of different ratings, and GPT can analyze it automatically. Okay, so that was quite a lot, right? But now I want to know, can you analyze the relationship between sugar, fat, and the total calories per cereal? So to analyze the relationship between sugar, fat, and the total calories per cereal, we can use the following approaches. It comes up with the idea to generate a scatter plot with regression lines and multiple linear regression. So what does GPT do? It generates code to plot the relationship, gives you a scatter plot, and also draws the regression line, even adds in confidence intervals. And then it also gives you an analysis of the actual results. So the scatter plot with a regression line shows a positive relationship between the amount of sugar and the total calories in cereals. Higher sugar content generally corresponds to higher calorie content. If we look at this, yeah, that's about right. Also makes sense. Then it also performs multiple linear regression, so using multiple variables. So you get nicely formatted regression tables that you can work with. It explains it. It also gives you an interpretation of R squared and adjusted R squared, the coefficients. So you can pretty much work with this, and I think with a few adjustments, put this in a paper. And it's a relationship between fiber and protein. It automatically chooses the right variables, looks at a scatter plot, performs a regression, then analyzes it. So I think this is a pretty cool tool if you, for example, want to quickly look at your data. So I did a few more of these, but then also just one more example. So for example, what I did here is, can you summarize these regression results for me? This is from a Bayes model, a fit. Provided just straight up copied the table into ChatGPT, and it sorted them, gave me regression coefficients for the different variables, was able to determine whether the effect is significant or not, the strength of the effect. And then I asked it, can you provide more detail? And it actually can. So it explains some of the effects, gives you an interpretation for it. So there's a lot more you can do with this. But yeah, that's like a quick introduction how, for example, I use it. I also use it for improving some of my writing. So for example, sometimes if I have some scattered thoughts, I write a paragraph, throw it into GPT, and it can actually generate a nicely reformatted paragraph that usually reads much better than, for example, what I have written. Okay, any questions about this? Yes?
You have to kind of check the terms of Kellogg's, like they allow using their data set or not?
So in this case, it's a Kaggle data set, so it's, oh yeah, you're right. So the question was, did I check with Kellogg's before or other cereal manufacturers to upload the data set? This is from Kaggle, which is a machine learning competition platform. In that case, it's open data. That is a very good question, though, in general, because, for example, would I upload raw data into ChatGPT that I'm not supposed to share? Of course not. So you should always be careful you're giving these data to a closed source commercial entity that can basically have access to it. So you should, of course, not upload like some sort of secure, I don't know, like the ad health data set or whatever to ChatGPT. Of course not. In that case, yeah, I did not ask for permission, but it was an open data set. But these questions, I think, are something where there's a lot of legal debates around it, whether you can use it or not. My suspicion is that OpenAI just collects all the data they can and use it no matter what, which comes with its own problems. But.
Thank you. I've been using ChatGPT since it came out in November 2022, paying for the version as soon as it came in March 2023, and I also pay for Gemini and Claude. And it's advancing at an extremely rapid way. And so I'm curious about, so now I just finished my third year. And so far there were, I don't know how many models that got published in the last year and a half. So I'm curious, by 2 years, when I finish my PhD, what are the tasks that a social scientist is doing today that ChatGPT or any of these models would not be able to replace?
So,
because I asked ChatGPT and it told me basically just qualitative ethnographic work and participant observation and that kind of things.
I think these models are only going to become more capable. What will happen in 2 years? I don't know. I think they also don't know. I think what will probably happen is the necessity to be able to code will become less and less important. Because, for example, for a lot of coding tasks, like I write like 80% of my code with GPT. I ask it all the time to, for example, improve my code or to make it faster. I think you still need a decent level of competency, though, because you also need to know what your data is actually supposed to look like. So one of the problems I think that arises, people just blindly use it, especially newer users, for example, to R, who give it a poorly prompted request. It generates some data. They think, okay, that's what should come out, but in fact, it's bad code. So I think some of these issues might be alleviated in the future, but I think that will take some time. So I still think that while productivity might increase because we can generate a lot more, for example, code, we don't have to spend as much time creating code anymore, there still needs to be some oversight and we got to look at it. So I don't think social scientists will be replaced in 2 years by ChatGPT, but I do think there'll be widespread use of these tools in order to increase productivity. So I hope that's a satisfying answer to your question. Yes?
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm still a little confused on why I would be interested in using my own GPT, because essentially, like, as I understand, the only thing that gets a little easier is that probably my prompts become a little shorter, because like I don't need to specify like what language I'm working with, but like other than that, if I have like a chat where I've been like working with some R code, it already knows that I'm using R code. So like, what is really like the point of creating my own GPT here? And what is your experience of using GPTs created by others that are available in the database? Because my experience was not that good. I found that like asking the standard GPT model to do something is usually or often more effective than using some of these like external add-ons or like external GPTs that are available. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so you kind of answered the question about why would you do a custom GPT, because that is precisely if you do particular actions that you do a lot of the times and you don't want to constantly add the prompt. So for example, I work with a lot of very big data sets with billions of observations. Most of the time, if I ask GPT for R code, it gives me dplyr solutions. dplyr is great, but I need data table because data table is a lot faster. So I've written, for example, a GPT, like my R data analysis GPT, to always default to data table if possible, so I don't have to constantly prompt it. So it's really creating an assistant for actions that you constantly perform. Otherwise, yeah, you don't need to do it because it's super capable, and it has been, the base version has become a lot more capable than just like a few months ago where it was really useful to use these apps. I think for the apps, it depends, and it's just trial and error. So for example, I've used Consensus, that's like a database for research articles. The coverage depends on what it covers. For some literature searches, for example, it's pretty good. For others, it hasn't been so great. So your mileage may vary. But generally, I would say you just got to try it out and see what works and what doesn't work. And the landscape is also constantly changing. So there's constantly new apps being thrown onto the market, stuff that might not be necessary after some time. So a lot of the, for example, previous apps for the previous versions have become outdated because people, or because the base version of GPT has increased so much in its capabilities.
You mentioned this example that we can use ChatGPT for editing, and like you have your own idea, you write this paragraph, but you don't like how it sounds, so you ask ChatGPT to edit it, and now it looks better. But what journals are thinking about it? Is it plagiarism? Is it ChatGPT generated?
Yeah, so I think some journals hate it, and they, for example, tell you that you can't use that you can't use ChatGPT. I think there's different approaches to it. So, for example, what I would say is if you write your own paragraph and you just ask it to restructure it, then you, for example, take the output and then edit it again. I don't see how that's different from, for example, employing a human editor. And me, for example, as a non-native speaker, like sometimes I could use the help of an editor. And ChatGPT is an easily available option for me to provide text and improve my text. So I think some journals outright ban it. I think if I would provide, for example, just a regression table and tell it, write me an article based on that, yeah, that's a little lazy. But I think for pure editing tasks, I don't really see the issue why you shouldn't be able to use it as long as it's your own work and it restructures it. But I'm sure some people will disagree with me.
We got one more.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much for this. And I guess my question is, like, especially for less advanced models, like what you showed in the beginning, like if you're just doing like the linear regression model, like the interpretation or the output of that is not like, that's maybe like undergraduate level interpretation. And so I wonder, like what you say that if you're using data sets with billions of observations, like I kind of understand why this might be more useful, but if you're not doing that, do you think that time is better invested like learning to code yourself still versus like, working with these types of models? Because just on the face of it, maybe it saves like 15 minutes or something, but I guess I'm skeptical that it's extremely useful for things that are not like extremely complicated right now.
Yeah, so I would never recommend anyone to purely rely on ChatGPT, but also, for example, you can use it to learn new techniques. So, for example, sometimes I write my code, then I have some challenge, I prompt GPT with it, and then it gives me a solution that I can work with. I think another important point related to your linear question, so it's definitely more reliable for less complex models or for simpler methods. So if you get into like a multi-level Bayesian specified with complex priors, it might fail more often, or for model classes that are, for example, not encountered as often. But I find it often to be still useful to just throw in the model, print out all of the, for example, coefficients with directions, whether it's significant or not, and then it's a little bit easier to work with that. or for example, interpretation of some of the effects, or if you have some output that you're not particularly used to. I think that for that, it has been incredibly helpful. But still, as a researcher, we have the responsibility to be able to verify whether it is right or not. And I think that's a little bit of a danger where people need some basic competence in, for example, programming in order to be reliably use these tools. Because else, yeah, you're just in the hands of the big machine that you don't know quite how it works.
Great, thank you very much.